Welcome to the App Story's 10th anniversary interview series, brought to you exclusively by OmniFocus 3 from the Omni Group. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We're making something of a habit of these conversations, it feels like.
I feel like I don't want to hear your voice anymore.
Well, I hope not.
I'm kidding.
But we need to get back to a regular schedule, that's for sure. So today we have two special guests with us. We have Ryan Cash and Harry Nesbitt, both members of Team Alto, the creator of Alto's Adventure and Alto's Odyssey. Two great games that we've covered many times on Mac Stories. And we wanted to talk to them a little bit today about not only those games and their development and the sorts of things that game developers face in creating games for the App Store, but also a little more broadly about the App Store as a game platform. Welcome to the show, Ryan and Harry.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I wanted to start off by asking a simple question, and I guess I'll start with you, Ryan. Can you tell us a little about the background of how Team Alto came to be, and if you can explain the differences between Snowman and Team Alto?
Sure. So I guess it all kind of began in 2011 when I left my previous job at Market Circle to start Snowman, and Jordan and I were, in the process of making Checkmark. And in doing that, I wanted to make sure that we had a really strong brand as a company and a really cool website. So I had noticed at the time there were some really cool illustrations on the Real Mac website on their About page. And there's sort of like cool character sort of drawings of each of the people who work there and had a little bit of personality for each person. So I thought those were really awesome. And I wanted to kind of come out of the gate with like a really high quality brand. So I looked into who had done them. And it turns out that person was Harry. So I reached out to Harry and asked him how much it would cost to do something similar for Snowman. And it was definitely just outside of our budget, but Harry's work was so good, I didn't want to try to negotiate or anything. So it was sort of something I decided we would do later down the road when we could afford it. And in the meantime, I just sort of told Harry, let's keep in touch and I'll reach out to you when we can do this. And then if you fast forward quite a while, I had just sort of kept in touch with Harry. He did these really cool Breaking Bad illustrations. And I was always just a really big fan of his work. And when Jordan and I started talking about the idea of making this game, which went on to become Alto's Adventure, Harry's artwork immediately came to mind. And I think it was one of those things that I don't even know if we would have started making the game if it weren't for Harry's art style as sort of like an inspiration and a starting place.
Yeah. So I think that was definitely the way things kind of got started. I think over the course of the project and particularly in between projects, we realized, this is much bigger than I think we initially realized. And so the need to sort of build out the team became much more of a front of mind concern. So what we eventually arrived at was this term Team Alto, which could hopefully encompass everybody who's working on the game. That would be sort of myself and my team here in the UK heading up the core creative, sort of the art and code and audio aspects of the project. Then with Snowman in Toronto, sort of taking the lead on production support and marketing and business, as well as a shared conversation around the design and QA of the games that we're making. Yeah, so Team Alto is sort of basically encompasses my team in the UK here and then Snowman. And I feel like, arriving at that place, it feels like we've struck the best balance of having two teams that are working very closely together, but also have very different focuses on what they're doing day to day. And I think having that perspective, having Snowman, they've got a little bit of a more objective stance on the creative process, which is very, very useful to bounce off of and sort of stay on track.
So Ryan, when you decided to work on the first Alto's Adventure, and when you reached the point where you decided that you wanted Alto's Adventure to be a paid upfront game on the App Store, did anyone try to persuade you not to do it and to follow maybe a freemium approach? Did anyone try to tell you this is a terrible idea? Why are you doing a paid upfront game on the App Store? It's never gonna work.
Yeah, I think there were definitely some people that sort of said, hey, what are you doing? No one's making premium games anymore. We had actually experimented we made a game called Super Squares that we started working on quite a bit after we started working on Alto's Adventure, but we launched it also quite a bit before Alto's Adventure came out. So it was a sort of smaller project in between. And that was our sort of first and only stab at doing free to play that we've ever done. And with that game, we actually hadn't really set out to make it free to play from the beginning necessarily, but it turns out that Jordan and I aren't really puzzle designers at our core. So we ended up having to kind of layer on some free to play mechanics in order to sort of fix some sort of fuzzy puzzle logic that we had thought was sound when we designed the game on paper. But once we started building it, it was a little bit flawed. And anyway, that was sort of our first dip into the free to play waters. And it wasn't, we didn't have any good results. And if anything, it was a little more scary, just sort of the idea that if it goes poorly, you may not make any money. And I think there was definitely a time where Alto's Adventure was sort of on track to potentially be a free-to-play game. We were completely new to gaming. We all kind of came from like a productivity utility app background. So we didn't really know what we were getting into. But there was a certain kind of turning point, I think, when we were working on Alto's Adventure, where we kind of said, we kept designing things to be free-to-play at a certain point. And then it just sort of always came back to, this doesn't feel right. This isn't what I would want if I downloaded this game. And we were kind of making the game for ourselves in many ways, that we just wouldn't be satisfied with the sort of decisions that we were making. So we kind of started thinking, like, what would happen if we just kind of got rid of all that nonsense and kind of went back to old school gaming where, you had to be good at the game. There were no sort of hacks or workarounds. So we started sort of thinking about that more and more. And then Monument Valley came out, I think it was in 2014, when we were sort of maybe 2/3 of the way through working on Alto's Adventure. And that sort of was a good backbone to sort of say, you can do well as a premium game on the App Store. And from that point forward, I think we had the confidence to sort of stick with our guts and just go for it and see what happens. And I think it's certainly really, really hard to make a premium game work on the App Store. But I think, like almost any business, it's really hard to make anything work. And I think the same is true of making a free-to-play game. There's that much more competition. You're going up against companies that are spending, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars a day on user acquisition. So there's competition on that side as well.
Ryan, one of the arguments I've seen, and one of the better arguments I've seen for free-to-play, has been to combat cloners. The idea that you make the game free and you put ads somewhere in between levels or something so that cloners don't have the ability to come in and undercut you on price. Have you ever had any problems with cloners for the Altos games and considered it in that situation?
Yeah, I think we've actually had the opposite thing happen, where a lot of people have made sort of free-to-play ripoffs of Alto's Adventure, and I think even Alto's Odyssey already. And if anything, I think for in most cases, people are definitely capitalizing on the App Store search and whatnot. But when they download those games, they're probably gone pretty quickly, because I always check them out to get a good chuckle. And there isn't really ever a game there. It's just kind of like a sort of spammy thing to try to push ads in someone's face. So there's no way that anyone's going to continue playing those games, because there's basically nothing there at all. So I think we kind of stand out as, there might be like 5 or 6 ripoffs, and they're all free, and their icons leave a little bit more to be desired. And so when you see them in the App Store, and then you see, oh, what's this game? It's $5, and it kind of looks nicer, and then you go and check it out, and it kind of helps us actually seem like the real deal. I've heard about this in kind of like in non-tech businesses, where sometimes like things that are actually priced higher, they're perceived by people to be higher quality, and therefore you sort of attract the right customer. Because I think anyone who's not willing to pay for a game, they probably wouldn't be buying Alto anyways. So for us, I think it works in sort of the opposite way.
Today's the last day of our App Store 10th anniversary interview series, and I wanted to give one final thanks to OmniFocus 3 for supporting this project. We couldn't have done this without OmniFocus's support. I want to cover just a handful of my very favorite features from OmniFocus 3, which was released recently by the Omni Group. One of them is notifications, because everybody is a little different in how they want to get notified of their tasks. What's nice about OmniFocus 3 is that notifications are highly customizable, and you can set as many of them as you want. If you're the kind of person who needs to be reminded of something over and over and over before it's due, you can do that. It's a great way to keep on top of all of your work. Like OmniFocus 2, notifications are automatically created for a task with a due date, but as I said, they're also very customizable. One of the customizations that I like the most is that you can set a reminder a certain amount of time before the task is due, which is a great way to set reminders for yourself when you know how long a task is going to take. Another cool addition to OmniFocus 3 is custom perspectives. You can make perspectives look exactly the way you want with a wide variety of beautifully designed icons. And if you don't find exactly what you want, you can use your own images in the perspectives so it looks exactly the way you want. And you can use a custom tint color so you can distinguish one perspective from another at a glance. There's powerful rule parameters in the Pro version of OmniFocus 2. You can filter and group projects and tags by using combined rules like all, any, and none. To learn even more, go to omnifocus.com and give OmniFocus 3 a try. There's a 14-day free trial, so there's nothing to lose. Thanks again to OmniFocus for supporting App Stories.
I would love to know from you guys, what was the creative process that led you to making a snowboarding game featuring llamas? Because that's a very specific combination of things for the first Alto's Adventure. And also, as a follow-up, if there are any specific video games that sort of inspired the making of the first Alto's Adventure.
So the llamas were an interesting story. I think because we kind of came at the game from two different directions. So Ryan and Jordan, grew up snowboarding, very passionate about making a snowboarding game, whereas I actually have never been snowboarding, although I will be going next week. So that'll be interesting for the first time.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, so I kind of came at it from a slightly different angle, and I was trying to find, I guess I'm not typically attracted to sort of the extreme sports aesthetic that's usually wrapped up with a lot of snowboarding games. And so I was trying to find kind of a different angle, like a unique take on how can this game have like a strong visual identity that doesn't sort of rely on that very specific aesthetic. So I started by looking into various mountain cultures around the world and tried to see if there was any common threads, visually and tonally that I could draw from. And I was very attracted to sort of the South American, Andean, Peruvian culture that, just immediately jumped out to me as having a real warmth and kind of, and I was immediately drawn to the llamas, which are a very big part of their culture out there. And so we were also thinking about what the game mechanics could be for this game. We were drawing a lot of inspiration from other endless runners that usually would have some kind of chasing mechanic, like something that's coming after you, that's compelling you forward, that you're having to perfect your skills to kind of escape from. And when we saw the llamas, we were like, well, what if we could, turn that on its head, and rather than being chased, you are actually chasing after something else that has escaped. From that point, this kind of whole narrative about, a young shepherd whose llamas have escaped and he's chasing after them down the mountain, it just sort of all immediately clicked into place. And I think at that point, that was sort of when Alto in its current form was born, and it gave the project a real clarity and direction from that point on. As to other games that have inspired, obviously I mentioned like other endless runner games, other mobile games, sort of things like Subway Surfers and Ski Safari, but also Tiny Wings, I think, is a big standout example. That this is a game that has such a confident aesthetic and tone. It's lighthearted without being, over the top or cartoony or sort of garish in any sense. And then there was also, I'm a long-time console game player, and so I kind of brought to it certain influences from a tonal standpoint, things like Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, and also Journey was a standout game for me. A game that is very much about the joy of just moving through a space, the sort of kinesthetic joy of just traversing and jumping and the flow, and all of that was very much at the heart of Alto's Adventure.
Yeah, I can really see the parallels to Journey, especially in how you move around the environment. Could you tell me a little bit about how you went from early prototypes to finished product? And I'm really interested and particularly hearing a little bit about the gameplay and exactly how you had a story and and had a direction, but how did that evolve during the course of development of Alto's adventure?
Sure. I think a lot of it kind of fell into place quite quickly. I mean, we knew we wanted it to be a 2D snowboarding endless runner, and there's only so much sort of variation within that you can find. So I think a lot of the early sort of prototypes were on getting the feel of that mechanic, that kind of endlessly snowboarding down a hill, being able to tap to jump and backflip. That came together, I think, pretty quickly, and I think within the first 2 or 3 months, we had a game that wouldn't look all too dissimilar from the final game. But what we then worked on was obviously a lot of the systems and the UI and the menus, but also trying to add as much variety to that gameplay as possible, like the trick system and the grinding and the elder chases, and obviously all the goals and the logic that goes behind those. So it was the actual core of the game came together pretty quickly, but all the supporting work took a lot of time to get right and perfect. And obviously there's an element of polish and detail that we wanted to, add to the game that sort of really benefited from a slightly longer production cycle. We had to move pretty slowly as a small team. And I think we benefited from a lot of the ideas that would sort of suggest themselves naturally over the course of time. You're looking at the same thing day in, day out. And sometimes, many months down the line, you'll have an idea for a thing and you think, well, let's try it out and put it in. And I think a good example of that is, the lighting system, this kind of dynamic weather and time of day that's always in constant motion. That wasn't something that we expected to have, from the beginning. And even, in some early experiments, wasn't sure if it was going to be technically feasible. But I think the point at which we managed to get that working was a real sort of pivotal moment in the project. We suddenly, it gave the project a certain life and vibrancy that it would have been lacking otherwise. It turned what was very much a game on a screen into suddenly almost like a window into a sort of a larger world. And that was very exciting for us.
So a couple of years pass, and after some updates to Alto's Adventure, you release Alto's Odyssey. Can you explain the challenge of making a game in the same style and maybe in the same universe as Alto's Adventure, making sure that the new game would feel new and original and worth people's money and time, but also consistent with the first game? How did you balance making a game that is sort of in the same style of the first one, but also new enough for people to buy it again?
It's a big challenge, and I think there's two sides to that. There's, from a mechanical standpoint, or at least kind of raw gameplay content, we want to make sure there's enough there that if you've played the first game and you completed the first game, there's enough there for you to be able to jump back in and get something out of it. But I think also from like a tonal standpoint, from a design and a visual standpoint, we want to make sure that this game feels fresh and it has its own voice, and it's not just retreading the same ground as the first game. So I think in both aspects, we sort of just tried not to take anything for granted and almost stripped back everything that we knew was working about the first game, but that we didn't want to rely on for the second. So from the mechanics standpoint, we actually had like a period of development that we called Alto Jam, which is where we tried a whole bunch of different crazy ideas to see what would stick, or at least to understand what aspects of those mechanics were working and when they felt like they belonged and when they felt like they were too extreme, or maybe they changed the gameplay in a way that was just adding too much complexity to things. So yeah, we learned a little bit about that. For example, the lemur, which in the final game is, in a lot of ways, it's a one-to-one replacement for the Elder, this thing that periodically chases you down the hill. And, you've got to jump at the right time and escape. We actually, for the lemur, we wanted to try mixing up that mechanic more than we eventually settled on, because we didn't want it to be perceived as just a kind of a straight swap, like, oh, we've just replaced the artwork for this mechanic and pretend it's something new. But we actually went through maybe 3 or 4 different iterations. Some of those iterations you're chasing the lemur. Some of them he steals your coins and you have to get them back. And it's like this double or nothing kind of mechanic where if you don't catch him, you lose all your coins. If you catch him, you get double. And we just found that most of those implementations just distracted from the simplicity of what the Elder brought to the first game. And yeah, I think we had to have the confidence to undo all of that work or take a step back and trust in what we knew worked and hope that we could find perhaps value elsewhere or even within that. Like there are subtle differences with the lemur, which I hope players notice. But yeah, I think learning that lesson the hard way or the long way was definitely tough. But yeah.
I think one other thing that was particularly sort of difficult was kind of keeping in mind that Alto's Odyssey might be, a follow-up game that a lot of Alto's Adventure players are going to enjoy. But I think also designing it with the fact in mind that it'll be a lot of people's first experience with an Alto game. And also sort of this ethos that we had that Alto's Odyssey wasn't a sequel, but rather it was another game in the Alto universe. And so we wanted players to perhaps discover Odyssey first and then find Adventure and go into it. So we had to make sure it was new enough and challenging enough that existing players would feel like there was something new there, as Harry mentioned, but also kind of know that it might be someone's first experience and that they may then go to Adventure after.
Ryan, this is for you. What led to the decision to use a desert setting? I mean, what did that afford the team in terms of, coming up with new mechanics and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think a desert was a sort of a setting that I personally always wanted to explore. I remember growing up, one of my uncles was always talking about how he went sandboarding when he was younger on his travels. And he was actually sort of one of my main inspirations for just wanting to travel more. He was always telling me to quit my job and go traveling every single time I saw him. And so I had this sort of story of him sandboarding looming in the back of my head as I was growing up. Being a snowboarder and a skateboarder myself, that just seemed like such a cool thing that I would, at the time, never get to do because, I was young and I was living here in Toronto. So that was something I always kind of had in mind. And even before Alto's Adventure was finished, I started sort of brainstorming some ideas on what we could do if we ever had the chance to explore the desert. And I actually think wall riding was actually something that we had sort of tossed around the idea of doing in Alto's Adventure, but we sort of didn't have time to explore it and thought we'd sort of save it for later. So yeah, that's kind of where I came from in terms of the desert. I've always just been fascinated with them as a setting on the planet. And then I think when Alto's Adventure was out and we had time to sort of take a step back and think about it, I think it was an idea that we all kind of were able to get on board with and decided to then explore.
So I'd like to discuss the App Store as the bigger picture of the App Store a little with you guys. It feels to me as if in terms of power that is available for to game designers and developers, the mobile devices and to an extent maybe even the Apple TV, but mostly iOS devices are approaching console quality level, or at least the games that we're seeing today from some big name publishers, they don't look nearly as simplistic maybe as they would have looked like 6 or 7 years ago. And in thinking about this, I wonder, should Apple maybe have more of an interest in the core gamer audience? Should they even bother with this? Do they care? And I kind of wanted to hear from you if you have any thoughts on whether Apple should or shouldn't compete, should do anything more, I guess, to appeal to the core gamer audience that, folks are still buying Nintendo consoles and PlayStation, and I guess some folks, the Xbox One.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something we often have talked about. I remember even years ago thinking, what would happen if Apple ever made, a console for the living room. And then I think the Apple TV was definitely at sort of them dipping their toes in that direction. And yeah, I mean, I think it remains, for our point of view, I think it would be really interesting. And I think it would only help increase the market and the awareness for video games. Yeah, I think games like, Fortnite coming to mobile are sort of starting to blur the lines between console and mobile. And I think something that we're really passionate about here is just the idea that the platform that you're playing a game on doesn't mean it's more or less special. Some of the best games of all time are on, PS4, but some of the best games of all time are also on iOS. And I think, a game like Florence, for example, can show that you can tell a really powerful, touching story that almost anyone can relate to just on an iPhone. And you don't need, a console with surround sound and a 60-inch TV to do it. So, I mean, I'd love to see Apple getting more and more into gaming, and it sort of seems like they're definitely getting behind it more and more. From kind of where I'm sitting, it seems like it's definitely something that they're really interested in. So yeah, I mean, like, should they do more? I don't know. But I think anything that they do in that space is really interesting to us, because I don't think they're the kind of company that just rushes into something just because there might be money on the table or a market there. I think anything they're going to do will sort of contribute to the space. And I think even recent changes to iOS devices, things like haptic feedback, have made gaming more immersive on their platforms. So from where we are, we're kind of just excited to see where things go.
This is a question for both of you, really. And I think I'll start with Harry. What is Apple doing right in the gaming space right now? And what are they really missing the boat on in 2018?
I mean, like I say, I've always come from a console background, but I would say in the last 6 or 7 years, especially after working on Alto's Adventure, I certainly turned to mobile gaming much more. I had developed an interest for it where I perhaps didn't have previously. And I think that was just at the time when there was a much richer sort of variety of experiences to be had on mobile platform. Things like, Monument Valley, these beautiful, immersive, artistic experiences. And so it's been really great to see, Apple get behind those. And I would say I think that Apple really should just play to the strengths of the platform. Like, it's a personal device. It's something you always have on you. So I don't necessarily know whether they need to compete necessarily, or whether there's anything necessarily different to do. I think in a lot of ways, it's for the developers to explore and figure out what is best suited for these devices. And I actually think some of my favorite mobile games are ones that don't try to be anything else, and create the things that you want to create on the platforms that allow it. And that might be different things for different developers.
Yeah, I would probably echo a lot of what Harry said. I think one thing that they're definitely doing right is helping to highlight the stories of developers, and you can see that in like the Today tab on the App Store. And I think putting people behind the things that people are getting to play or even use as, like, if it's not a game and it's an app, I think that's something that, for the first 8 or 9 years of the App Store, I guess it was 8.5 or so, that wasn't there. So you downloaded an app or a game and you had no idea if it was made by one person or 100 people, or what was the process behind it, where the inspiration came from. So I think the new Today tab in the App Store is really helping to tell that story. And I think that'll, continue to get richer and better. And of course, they can't really tell every single story because there's so many apps coming out every week. But I definitely think that's a step in the right direction. And I think what Apple chooses to highlight and show off, in whether it's their keynote or on their website or in the Today tab, they're generally choosing a lot of really interesting things that are made by smaller teams, which is just really cool to see, because those people don't always have a voice elsewhere. A technical thing that I think could be improved, or maybe more of a hardware thing, and I'm sure it's just on the radar and it's a matter of limitations, is just a little bit more cohesiveness between devices would, I think, open up a few opportunities for developers. So an example that comes to mind is just that, for example, the iPad doesn't have 3D touch or haptic feedback. And so you can't really design a game that's going to work on iPhone and iPad that strictly takes advantage of that. It's sort of used as an extra, and it would be maybe cool for game developers to explore a game that's, played entirely through 3D touch or with haptic feedback. Having said that, I'm not even sure if that would make sense, but I think it's just something that would be nice for us. A good example I have personally is I started playing Florence on my iPad. I generally prefer to play a more, narrative driven game that you maybe can play in one sitting. I'll generally gravitate towards my iPad to do that. And so I played through most of Florence on my iPad, but managed to, or I ended up taking a break before I finished. And I ran into someone and they said, "Have you played it on your iPhone?" And I said, "No." And they said, you really should check it out. The haptic feedback is incredible. And so I started playing it on my iPhone 10 the next time I played it. And you're sort of torn between which is more immersive. Like I do love the bigger screen of the iPad. I have the 10.5 inch, but the haptic feedback on the iPhone was really great. So that's just kind of like a little nitpicking thing, and I'm sure it's on the radar, and it's just a matter of making haptics work on a screen that big is not easy. But yeah, in terms of like what other things I think they could do better, I don't really have any suggestions because I do think Harry made a really good point about the fact that I do kind of like that it's different than a console and that we have different design challenges and different goals. But for us, I think one of the most important or exciting things is that you can reach such a big audience on mobile. And I think there's an interesting opportunity for video games, and I think it's been happening to sort of be looked at in a different light. I mean, now I'm rambling on, but when I was growing up, video games, at least in my household, were kind of seen as something bad and something that was like wasting your time and very unproductive. Not that TV was necessarily any better, but I would say like video games just sort of seemed to be even worse. It kind of, I think it was looked at as, just a way to kind of kill time and have sort of no real merit in the real world. And I think that's changing a lot. There are really powerful stories being told in video games, and that's something that I think I'm pretty passionate about seeing is just games not being looked at as necessarily just a waste of time, but something that can actually help you through something or teach you something about yourself, and that's really exciting to me.
You raise hardware, and I agree with that. I mean, it goes even beyond haptics, I think, because there are differences between different platforms in terms of the colors that can be reproduced and the kind of frame rates that they can sustain and that sort of thing. But one of my biggest frustrations has always been game controllers and the Apple TV, because Apple did dip their toe into games on the television with the Apple TV, but they seem to always have been somewhat conflicted when it came to controllers, because when that was announced, I think they initially said that developers could require game controllers, but then they went back on that and required that the Apple TV remote be used. And now we're back to this situation where game controllers can be used. And when I look at the controllers that are on the market, they're all kind of straight up Bluetooth, which has issues because of lag and that sort of thing. And then I look at something like the AirPods, and I think Apple's got technologies already to layer on top of Bluetooth to help tune it and reduce lag and reduce some of the issues that are inherent to that technology. I mean, what are your thoughts, Ryan, on controllers and what you'd like to see, if anything, from Apple in that space to make the Apple TV maybe a little more appealing to game developers?
That's something we talk about quite a bit in the studio. I think it's definitely something that we'd love to see. I think at that point, it would almost make the Apple TV and sort of the fact that Apple's products, tend to refresh every year or maybe within every 2 years. That's pretty exciting, because something like a traditional console like a PlayStation or an Xbox, those life cycles are like 4 or 5 years or something like that. So I think at that point, the Apple TV almost becomes like a full-blown living room console if they do have a controller. And I mean, I think Apple generally, if they do something, they like to kind of not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but really do something kind of new and original. So I have this weird conflicting thing where I feel like if they just made a controller that's, essentially looks like a PlayStation or an Xbox controller, and it's white, it's got the AirPod technology, I feel like that would just work really well. But I also at the same time feel like it's a little bit un-Apple maybe to just, take the existing controller framework and design and just make their own. I feel like usually they like to kind of do something different. And maybe that could be something subtle, like the way they do haptics or something like that. But I definitely think it would bridge the gap between console and Apple TV and mobile and stuff like that. I do think one issue, though, is that a lot of people buy an Apple TV just so they can, AirPlay videos from their phone or watch YouTube or Netflix. And so they may not want to pay for that. So maybe they would make like a game edition of the Apple TV or something that comes with a controller, or maybe you can buy the controller separate. But I certainly think that would, at that point, essentially make the Apple TV a full-blown console. And then sort of as another caveat, I do also think it's kind of cool having the constraint of the Siri remote to work with, because it sort of produces some interesting gaming ideas. But I think there's only so much you can do with a Siri remote. Like one of the games we're working on, I don't think there'd be a way to do it with the Siri remote. It just wouldn't work. So having a console style controller would be really awesome.
So, and I wanted to ask this question to both of you. Since you've been working on the Alto series and you made Alto's Adventure, Alto's Odyssey, it's been a few years now. What do you hope that people take away from the games that you make? What do you hope that people feel when they play your game? Is there any kind of story or anecdote that you want to share about, since you've been making these games? I think it's been 4 years at this point, and I kind of wanted to hear from you. What's the big takeaway for about this experience of making games on the App Store?
Yeah, sure. I think I would echo a lot of what Ryan was saying earlier about there's a joy, I think, and a kind of a heartwarming sort of feeling that comes with making a game that creates a lasting impression, that adds to people's lives rather than sort of subtracting from it. It's getting away from this idea of games as time wasters. Actually, they could give you experiences that actually enrich your life and hopefully give you a new perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think we've seen that most profoundly with some of the sort of emails that we've received from players who tell us about, how this game has helped them through difficult times in their life. Maybe they're struggling with anxiety and the game gives them a little bit of kind of a break from that. Or perhaps it's helped them to connect with a child or a loved one who, is otherwise unable to kind of relate in a normal way. Yeah, you want to take away this idea that games can be meaningful to people, even if it's just a small way, even if it's just like a moment in someone's day that you're actually adding to their lives.
Yeah, I think Harry covered kind of everything that I would pretty much say. The only thing I would add too is like another kind of example is I think video games can often inspire people to do things in the real world. I recently, or actually not that recently, but I played What Remains of Edith Finch maybe about 6 months ago. And that's a game that is really powerful and could actually cause you to maybe re-examine your life and what you're doing. And I could, not currently, but I could see that if I was in a different place in my life where I have been, that game could actually kind of wake me up and get me to make a big change. And another example too is I think games just inspiring, or another example of a game sort of inspiring you to do something in the real world might be just getting out and seeing nature. Like I think, I don't know for sure, but I think something like Alto, for example, being out in the beauty of the natural environment in the game can actually kind of make you want to go out and do that in real life. And yeah, I think that's really cool.
So what can you share right now? What are you comfortable sharing about what both Snowman and Team Alto are working on next?
Yeah, I guess I can talk about some Snowman stuff first. I think we've announced several games that we are still working on, so we're trying to kind of finish those up as quickly as we can, but everything seems to take a lot longer than expected. But for us, I feel like it's always for good reason, and with the kind of games that we want to make that we hope kind of linger with people for a long time, we don't want to rush them at the door. So unfortunately for people waiting for them, it means they have to wait longer, but I think we hope the wait is always worth it. And in terms of specific games, I don't really have any like news to share in terms of timeframes or anything like that, but we are working as fast as we can and as hard as we can to make sure we finish what we're working on in the way that we.
Yeah, and I would chime in there to say, like on the Alto front, as long as we're seeing fans respond sort of positively towards these games, I think there's always going to be a place in our heart for them, and we'll always be wanting to return to that world and explore it and find new stories to tell and new experiences to give. But I think as with Odyssey, it's not a foregone conclusion, and we want to wait until the right idea strikes at the right time that we can really get passionate about. And yeah, I think, as you mentioned, it's been many years. I think it's just over 5 years since we first got started. And so I think we are also keen to look at explore other things, other types of games. But yeah, I think Alto will always be there in the back of our minds as something that we're keen to.
Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate you joining us today. This has been a great conversation. We're big fans of both Alto's games, and it's always interesting to talk to people about the process of creating games and a little bit about the bigger picture stuff that's been going on, because, we're 10 years into the App Store, and games have obviously played a central role in that. And it's always interesting to see how that works when it comes to the App Store and how it differs from just some of the other apps that are on the App Store. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Well, that concludes our App Store 10th Anniversary interview series. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks, too, to OmniFocus 3 for supporting this project. Talk to you tomorrow, Federico.
Ciao, John.